Have you wondered about the role of the Federal Reserve in all of these trillions of dollars that the federal government is spending during the coronavirus crisis? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle, the show, as many of you know, that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who also advances the principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism and has done for a long time and teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, good to be back with y'all in these somewhat arduous times when we're still living under a lockdown mode. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation and this is your first exposure, you can come and visit us at fff.org, where we've got 30 years of articles and videos and conferences and things that you can access. Also, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and send us emails and questions and whatever. Okay, Richard, so one of the big aspects of what's going on here deals with monetary policy. And you've written this great book for the Future of Freedom Foundation called Monetary Central Planning in the State, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. And we've got a fascinating situation here. I mean, we've got really a really bad economic system where the state has plundered and looted people through the IRS for decades to fund the massive welfare state and the massive warfare state that has been brought into existence and under which we've all been born and raised. And now this coronavirus crisis is exposing that people just don't have any savings, or a lot of people don't have any savings, in large part because the government's taken so much money from them in income taxes, payroll taxes, and then at the state and local level, state taxes, property taxes. I mean, the so-called war on poverty that we've been living under all these years has left a lot of people impoverished, and that's what this crisis is exposing. And then you've got this horrendous healthcare system that's based on central planning that has caused massive increases in the death rate and the infection rate here that, of course, never would have happened in a free market. And then, they've got this stimulus package where, $2 trillion. I mean, who knew that they had all this money, that Uncle Sam was our rich uncle, that they were hiding this money under a bed or what? I mean, everybody thinks that, my gosh, the federal government's rich, it's rich. It brings to mind Frederick Bastiat's famous line of, the state is the great fictitious entity by which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else. The only place government gets money is through taxation. And that's either direct taxation with the IRS, which they're obviously not going to do. When they're sending out this $2 trillion, I don't think they want to be saying, well, we got to raise this $2 trillion in taxes. And so, of course, this is not a magic act. They can't turn, lead into silver or lead into gold. So that's where the Federal Reserve comes in. I mean, that's been the role of the Federal Reserve since its inception, is to finance these out-of-control expenditures by buying up the debt. And everybody thinks, oh, this is great, man. The taxpayers are on the hook for all this debt, this $2 trillion, plus another, $24 trillion of the federal government's debt. But now we've got the Fed paying off that debt. They've got the printing press running 24/7 now. They're printing money like it was going out of style. And we've seen this decade after decade after decade. I mean, they destroyed what had been the finest monetary system in history. And then once they destroyed that system, the gold coin, silver coin standard, they started just printing money through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, 80s, all the way up, debasing the currency, devaluing the currency, and wiping out people on fixed incomes, people at the lowest echelons of the economic ladder. I mean, they've just, look what they've done to the dollar. I mean, look at the value of the dollar over the last 50 years. I mean, it's just cratered because of the Federal Reserve. And really what they're doing is taxing people indirectly. I mean, that inflation tax And it's really the federal government that causes the inflation, even though the economics professors and all these colleges say, oh, inflation's this phenomenon that we don't know where it happens. It's like the coronavirus. We have to attack it. It's the Federal Reserve that is inflating the money supply, devaluing the currency, and really taxing people. It's a secret tax. It's a surreptitious tax. You can't see the tax, but when the value of people's money is plummeting, that's a tax. It's an indirect tax. It's a fraudulent tax. But this is a crooked and corrupt system, and all that we libertarians can do is just keep fighting against it, exposing it to the American people, and then setting forth what the real standard should be, a free market monetary system, just like Friedrich Hayek called for in his essay, The Denationalization of Money, which would even be an improvement on this finest monetary system in history, a free market monetary system. So what do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that it's worth reminding ourselves, as you were suggesting, is that how does government get the money that it spends? And traditionally expressed as it has three avenues or methods. One, it taxes the population. The government does not produce goods and services for which it earns revenue by selling things on the market as if it's a private enterprise. It produces nothing. What it does is taxes the private sector and siphons off a part of the wealth produced each year by the private sector, and then spends those dollars and the real resources those dollars represent in terms of its purchasing power in the market on what the politicians and the bureaucrats think that money should be spent on, instead of the private members of the society who produce that wealth in the free enterprise system. The second method by which the government can acquire money to spend is by borrowing. Now, if it borrows, it creates an impression that the government can spend dollars without taxing, and it's true. It goes into the financial markets, and in a traditional way, it basically outbids private borrowers by offering a higher rate of interest to lenders than the private borrowers would find it profitable to do in terms of private opportunities. And therefore, part of the savings of the society and the real resources that saved money represents is siphoned off from the private sector, and then again spent the way the politicians and the bureaucrats think that savings should be spent, instead of the decision of lenders lending that money to private borrowers, and based upon relatively sound, thoughtful investment decisions, using that savings to invest in projects and enterprises and research and development and expanded manufacturing facilities that will improve the standards of living of each of us in their quantities and qualities looking down the road. And then there's a third method by which the government has a means of siphoning off part of the wealth of the society, and that is it can print money. Now, of course, in the old days, money actually was printed. The government would have a printing press, and whatever image or face was on it, it printed out these units of money, whether they be called French francs or British pounds or US dollars or whatever, and then the government would just spend this, and then they would siphon off resources by using those dollars to buy real goods and services in the market, and basically by rising prices outbidding members of the private sector who had produced that output. Now, the method by which the Federal Reserve operates, and in fact was laid down in the original charter of the Federal Reserve when it was brought into existence by the Congressional Act of 1913, and then the Federal Reserve actually opened its doors in January of 1914. So it's a little over a century old. The Federal Reserve was technically prohibited from just directly creating the money to cover government expenses above what it was taxing. It has had this procedure where the Federal Reserve goes into the financial markets. It offers government securities, basically IOUs, if people in the private sector of the financial markets will lend the U.S. Treasury X number of dollars. And then the people who have lent these dollars to the Treasury, the U.S. government, hold these bonds, these securities, until the maturity, if they wanted to. And during this process, the Treasury would have to tax people as time went on to pay, besides anything else it was taxing people for to cover, the pay back the principal and the interest. But the way this has ended up working is that, and the structure of the Federal Reserve, so the Treasury issues an IOU, a government security. Someone lends a certain sum of money to the Treasury. Now, at this point, there's nothing inflationary. Jacob Hornberger comes to me and says, Richard, will you lend me $100 for a month? And while I would normally be dubious of lending Jacob anything, but for the sake of the example here, we'll assume he's an honest, trustworthy, reliable guy. So I lent him $100 for a month, let's say. Now, there's nothing inflationary here. There's no increase in the purchasing power of in the society, because I have $100 less in my pocket for this period of the loan, and he has $100 more in his pocket of the period of loan. But on that, there's been no increase in the number of dollars in our little two-person economy here. And when the government borrows in that sense, it may have a lot of undesirable effects, siphoning off wealth that could have been used for private productive investment, etc. But there's nothing necessarily inflationary in it. The inflationary part comes in because what the Federal Reserve can do is it can go into what's called the secondary market. That's the secondary market where people are holding in their portfolios the government securities that the government has issued to borrow money from them in some earlier period of time. And the Federal Reserve buys up those government securities out of the portfolios of banks, financial institutions, private individuals, foreign governments, and creates money. That is, you sell me this government security, and we'll pay you a price that more than compensates you to not hold it till maturity. That is, wouldn't you rather have your money back today rather than wait for Uncle Sam to pay it back to you on day X sometime in the future? We'll give you the money now, and at a price that makes it more advantageous to sell that government security to us than to hold it to collect the principal and interest in the future. So now the government securities pass into the hands of the Federal Reserve. So how does the Federal Reserve pay for this, Jacob? Well, what they basically do is that they just create money out of thin air. Now, we do have dollars in our pockets, those are printed dollars, which are printed up by the Federal Reserve, but most money that is used, transacted, entering into exchanges are all on computer money. There are credit cards, there are checks, there are debit cards, and everything else. So what the Federal Reserve does is it buys that government IOU, that government security, and it credits some bank's account for that sum. And where does that sum of money come from that it credits to that bank, let's say? Well, there's an office at the New York branch of the Federal Reserve that handles these financial transactions. And some guy is at the monitor of his computer screen, and he's been given instructions. And by the click of a mouse, basically what happens, he just creates that money and credits it to some bank's account. And that bank then has the money to cover some individual's account who has gotten a check from the Federal Reserve for having sold it or that person the government security. So it's just done in an indirect way. The Fed borrows the money from the private sector sells the government security to the Fed, and the Fed creates money in buying it. And that's how money comes into the banking system. New money comes into the banking system. The banks find themselves with more money. The banks want to make money by lending money. They offer it at more attractive terms and interest rates. More borrowers take it up. More dollars, therefore, enter the real economy. The dollars are spent on investment and goods and services and finally consumption as people are hired and they earn income, and prices in various and sundry various ways start percolating and rising. That's the inflationary process. And that's how basically most of the government's debt, this $23 trillion of accumulated debt over the decades, has been basically paid for. Now what is happening is an institutional change that, in a sense, everyone calls it magic, but is in fact actually a more honest method because of this coronavirus crisis. Basically, the Federal Reserve is loosening those rules, basically abridging the written rules and practically saying that it won't necessarily wait until the Treasury has borrowed money and passed a government security to a private sector's hands. It will now basically buy those government securities directly. So it's basically just the Federal Reserve directly and immediately creating money for these government securities, which then pass into the Fed's own investment portfolio. Now, there's another point here. Now, sometimes people say, well, wait a minute. If the Treasury is even borrowing directly from the Fed or indirectly through that other secondary market, and all these government treasuries, these securities are sitting in the Federal Reserve hand, well, doesn't the U.S. government then owe the principal and the interest to the Federal Reserve? Gee, the Federal Reserve must be making a lot of money. No, it doesn't work that way. Because the rules of the Federal Reserve from its beginning is that any profits earned by the Federal Reserve through holding government securities are to be returned to the Treasury as a gift. So basically, other than some minimal, I suppose, written off administrative expenses, virtually everything that the Treasury pays the Federal Reserve, principal and interest, is paid back to the Treasury with the other hand. So in fact, all of this is being financed at no cost to the U.S. government. It's just created money at no expense. So now what they're planning to do is the Federal Reserve is going to more openly just buy government securities. It's going to buy more of those mortgage-backed securities that the Federal Reserve was buying up before and then after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and create more money on that basis. And now the Federal Reserve is saying, as part of this crisis changes of directions and procedures, is that now the Federal Reserve is going to more directly lend money to banks and to private sector businesses and corporations who find themselves in financial dire straits. So we're going to, quote, directly lend you this money to keep you financially afloat. And again, the Federal Reserve has no money other than what it prints. So this is the means by which the Federal Reserve institutionally, traditionally, and now in these new ways, is basically going to be creating this massive amount. They've already talked about, at a minimum, $4 trillion of more money put into the economy. Yeah. Now, right now, these are bad times. And the governments, particularly the state and local governments, and some rules of the federal government, have said this basically forms of lockdown. You can't go to work. You have to shut your business. You can't go out and buy anything except groceries, etc. So immediately when all this money starts coming into the economy through Fed policy and the government borrowing, it's unlikely to expect to see a significant rise of prices right away, because the money's being created, it's passing into people's hands technically, but you can't go out and spend it. And you don't have a job, so you feel reluctant to spend. But once the economy starts coming out of this, in whatever weird way the government starts releasing the lockdowns in different parts of the nation, and people start going back to work, and you can go shopping and go out to a restaurant and watch a movie or go to a sports stadium or just go in and buy a pair of shoes at the mall or whatever, that money is going to start percolating through. And it will be very surprising if we don't start seeing, at some point down the road, significant price inflation due to this. So basically, this is the magic that's been created. Now, if I can just add one or two more things, Jacob. There is this new group of monetary gurus who are called the advocates of modern monetary theory. And they're basically saying that this is all good. Stop with this smoke and mirrors. The Treasury first borrows the money in the private sector, then the Federal Reserve buys those government securities and creates money indirectly through this circuitous route. Just let's be open and honest. The government can spend anything it wants in any amount by just printing money. And that means you don't have to tax. We don't need taxation. The government can just create money wealth out of thin air. So is this unlimited? No. there can be a situation, though we're not sure how long it might take or how important it might be, but that we could reach, quote, full employment. There's no more slack in the economy, and then prices might start rising. So then what's the purpose of taxes, according to them? To siphon money out of the economy to slow down the price inflation that the printing of the money has caused. So it's a way to control inflation. Taxes is not a means to cover the expenses of government. So this is the new magic they're playing. But the bottom line is that variations on this theme have been tried in many places, in different parts of the world, at different times. And at the end of the day, when it is followed aggressively enough, well, the monetary debasement of the French Revolution, the huge inflations on both the Union and Confederate sides during the American Civil War, the great inflations of all the belligerent countries during the First World War, and then the poster boy inflation cases like Weimar Germany in the early 1920s in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. And now, of course, most recently, the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, what we're seeing in Venezuela today. So like causes bring like effects. You can candy coat it in different theoretical garments, but the fact is, if you print money, and whether you're doing it directly or indirectly to fund what government is doing, at the end of the day, that money passing into more and more people's hands and attempting to buy the limited and real goods and services existing in the economy will generate rising prices and dramatically and increasingly higher and higher prices until you are threatened with what economists call a hyperinflation. And a hyperinflation is usually just defined as a situation in which prices in general and on average are rising 50% or more per month. Now, if that seems like a lot, countries that have had real hyperinflations, thousands of percent per month. How do you even manage operating a business or making your budgetary decisions in a society in which you have no idea what the price of anything is going to be tomorrow, other than that it's going to be a lot more, but you have no idea for sure what your revenue or incomes will be to be able to cover those prices that are going to be a lot higher than they were today.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points. When you were talking about Weimar Germany, I was thinking of the people that were going to the store with wheelbarrows of paper money, of German marks, and buying a loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow. And they had to rush in there because if they waited till the next day after they get paid, the price of the loaf of bread would be 2 wheelbarrows full of paper money. I mean, this is what happens with hyperinflation. And Richard, it's just logical. I mean, let's assume that the government had not ordered this whole shutdown, that you had a free market society and the healthcare industry said, we really need to do this, and stores just started shutting down voluntarily. I mean, there would be obviously massive economic destruction from this natural phenomenon, very similar to what you might have today. You've got right now Neiman Marcus that's looking like they might declare bankruptcy. Macy's, all the big department stores, Penny's, are all looking at dire financial straits here and the possibility of bankruptcy. But the notion that all you need is a government agency to print money up to save this situation is just so ludicrous on its face. I mean, if that was a case for restoring economic health to an economically devastated society, there would be no poor countries in the world. I mean, North Korea is essentially a devastated society economically. Cuba is. Venezuela is. If all you needed was a government agency to start cranking up the printing presses and doing all these shenanigans with bonds and borrowing and so forth, there wouldn't be any poverty in the world. And yet there it is. And so the notion that the U.S. can get away with this is just so obviously illogical. Now, the other point that I want to raise in this that you kind of alluded to is the effects of sucking all this money out of the private sector. I mean, not only are you sucking money out of the private sector through taxation, which is around $3 trillion, but then you've got sucking money out of wealth out of the population indirectly through the debasement of the value of their money. Now, I think we need to go back to fundamentals here. I mean, remember the title of Adam Smith's book was, in 1776, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Smith wanted to know, what is it that causes wealth in a nation? Why are there some nations wealthier than others? As you know, I grew up on the border in Laredo, Texas. It's the poorest city in the United States. And yet, right across the river in Nuevo Laredo, the poverty was significantly bigger. Why? I mean, it's just a river that's separating this huge metropolitan area. Why is there more poverty over there and less poverty over here? Well, the American people discovered the answer for that. I mean, this is one of the greatest contributions that America has made to mankind ever, that America's discovered the cause of wealth. Now, we hear, what are the causes of poverty? Well, that's a ridiculous question. Poverty is the natural state of mankind. Throughout history, people have been poor. The question is, what causes wealth? And Americans discovered the answer to that, and it was through capital accumulation. You had a society where there was no income tax. People kept everything they earned. There was no forced charity, welfare statism. There was no warfare statism, foreign escapades, big military establishment. None of the stuff that we have today. If you made it, you kept it, and you decided what to do with it. Well, naturally, people decided to save a large portion of their income. They would put it into banks, and all of a sudden, farmers would say, hey, there's money there available. I'd like to get a tractor. Well, the bank, we can lend you the money to buy that tractor. We have it. All these people have saved their money. They've put it in our banks. And so the farmer would go buy the tractor. And then all of a sudden, all his workers on his farm become more productive. Now, instead of producing 1,000 bushels of wheat, he's producing 20,000 bushels of wheat. And that means higher wages for workers because everybody else is doing the same thing. And this was the key to rising standards of living. It was capital accumulation that was coming about through savings. That's what Americans discovered. And then, so when you look into the late 1800s, early 1900s, the standard of living of the American people was soaring. Inventions, automobiles, I mean, everything was so dynamic. Everything was on the upswing. Poor people were becoming rich in 2 or 3 generations, passing wealth on to their children that they had saved. And then it all comes crashing down with the welfare warfare state in the 20th century. That's when they start sucking this monumental amount of money that would have gone into savings and productive capital into funding this ridiculous welfare state and warfare state. And it's that capital consumption, sucking that money out, is why today so many people are having trouble making ends meet with no savings, living paycheck to paycheck, unable to make it through a month or two of a rainy day or unemployment. It's because this is what this system has done to people. If we had had the same system on which America was founded, we would have a standard of living here that just boggles the mind. If all those trillions of dollars, decade after decade, had stayed in the private sector, it just boggles the mind how much better off people would be, where they'd have tons of savings in the bank that would get them through a crisis like this.
Yeah, if I can sort of extend, the precariousness and tragedy of the hyperinflation. You were mentioning the wheelbarrow. The fellow at the height of the Great German Inflation in October and November of 1923. One variation of that story is that he has his wheelbarrow full of the German marks. He stops in front of the bakery, takes an armful to buy a mere loaf of bread, and when he comes out with the loaf, he finds that the marks are on the pavement and someone has stolen the wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow was more valuable than the millions of marks that had been in it. The other instance is that I actually had the opportunity to meet a few people who had lived through that great inflation. One of them was a man named Adolphus Redley. He actually had been an associate of Ludwig von Mises in the years between the 2 world wars. And I had an opportunity to meet him one time when I was having tea with Margit von Mises in her New York apartment. And he told me that he was in Berlin in that autumn of 1923. And he sat in a Berlin cafe, ordered a cup of coffee. And in the time that it took to drink the cup of coffee, the price of the cup had doubled. I obviously had a shocked look on my face. And he looked at me And he said, you know what the moral of that lesson was? Drink fast.
That's amazing.
But it was devastating. There was a story of a rather well-known German writer. He was now an elderly gentleman in the 1920s. Had made a fairly good income as a writer, author, journalist, and had accumulated a nice, tidy sum for his later years. So in that autumn of 1923, he took out his entire life savings, and it was enough to buy one token for the trolley ride around Berlin. He took that ride around his beloved city, went home and put his head in the oven and committed suicide. I mean, when inflation is so bad that a savings of a lifetime disappears in a matter of weeks or months because of erratically and astronomically rising prices, this is what these situations lead to. And while people say, well, it can never happen here, well, let's hope it never happens here. But like causes do bring about like effects, and the same dangerous and outrageous economic policies, if followed significantly here, will lead to the same consequences that we've seen in other nations.
Yeah, and as you point out, it just wipes people out. I mean, like the guy that you explained, I mean, his entire life savings wiped out because of their counterpart of the Federal Reserve.
Yes.
And if you look at the reaction of people to us libertarians, they say, oh, you all are mean and hard-hearted, and you're against the stimulus package, and this money's coming in to save us. We're the ones that are there saying this is a magic act that will destroy this country. And just look at these other countries like you're talking about. This is how people's savings gets wiped out. People on fixed incomes, little widow that was there getting her pension from her husband's company, and he's now deceased. She's getting her $200 a month that now buys nothing. This is what this process does. It's like a siren song. Oh, come in, everything will be fine. But then all of a sudden, when the ship hits the rocks and everything, people start realizing, boy, Ebeling and Hornberger knew exactly what they were talking about. And so what we really need to do, Richard, is just build the foundation for a better society. I mean, granted, this is all water under the bridge, and it's water under the bridge as they're doing it now. But no course is inevitable. And I think people, as they start reflecting on this and they start doing some soul searching, they're going to think, there's a better way here. And that way is through the free market and a limited government, the founding good principles of America. And that's what we have to keep doing is painting that picture of the new America, the new direction that we need to head in.
Yeah, in the 1950s, the famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises wrote an essay called Trends Can Change. It's very easy to become despondent and pessimistic because you think that what seems to be the trends of your own time are irreversible, cannot be moved into a different direction. But the fact is, as Mises says there, trends have changed in the past and they will change again in the future. But what makes social, political, economic trends change is the courage and the integrity and the willingness of people to fight for sounder and better ideas of freedom and free markets.
On that excellent note, we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
Enjoyed the conversation as always, and look forward to talking to you next week and sharing perspectives on liberty with people who come in and view our videos. And thank you all for viewing, and thanks for your feedback and your emails that we receive from you. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we look forward to talking to you all next week.
Until next time.